Her sons divided everything before the funeral. Flowers had wilted. The house, the savings, the truck, the tools, even the old dog. Dorothy Bellamy was 71, a widow of 9 days, and she was standing in her own kitchen being told she needed to find somewhere else to live. 38 years of marriage, 2 sons she had raised with her own hands, and all that remained was a suitcase, a coat, and a rusted key her husband had kept in a tobacco tin he never let anyone open. She did not know what the key was for. Not yet. But when she finally found out, it changed everything her sons thought they had already won. If this story speaks to you, stay until the very end. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you do not miss the next one. The morning after Frank Bellamy's funeral, the kitchen table was covered in papers. Dorothy stood at the edge of the counter, holding a cup of coffee she had made out of habit rather than thirst, watching her 2 sons sit across from each other with documents spread between them, like a map to somewhere she had not been invited. Ray, the older one, 44, had driven in from Virginia Beach 3 days before the burial. He sold commercial insurance and had not visited in more than a year before his father's death. Beside him sat his wife, Tammy, with a calculator app open on her phone. Dean, the younger son, 41, lived 40 minutes away in Beaufort. He came to the house once every 2 months, usually to borrow something from the workshop or eat a meal Dorothy had cooked before driving home without helping clear the table. Dorothy looked at the papers, but did not sit down. She had not been asked to. "The house is paid off," Ray said, reading from a document she had never seen. "Dad's name is on the deed. The truck's in his name. The checking account has about $14,000 left. There's also the workshop tools," Dean added. "The table so alone is worth something." Dorothy set her coffee down. "Your father has been gone 9 days." Ray glanced at her briefly. "We know that, Mom, but things need to be handled." "Handled." She repeated the word as though tasting something stale. Tammy spoke without looking up from the phone. "There's no will on file. That means everything goes through the estate. Since the house is in Frank's name, it will pass to his legal heirs." Dorothy looked at Tammy for a long moment, then at Ray, then at Dean. "I am his wife." "Of course you are," Dean said, but his tone had the same shape as a sentence that ends with the word "but." "It's just that without the will, the state has a process. Ray and I are next of kin too." "You're telling me that this house, the house I have lived in for 38 years, is not mine?" Ray leaned back in his chair. "Legally, Mom, it's complicated." It was not complicated. Dorothy understood that much. What was complicated was watching 2 men she had carried, fed, taught to walk, nursed through fevers, and driven to school for 18 years each, sit at her kitchen table and talk about dividing her life as though she were already gone. Over the next 6 weeks, things moved faster than she could hold on to. Ray and Dean hired an attorney who filed the estate papers. Because there was no will, the property was subject to intestate succession. The house was appraised, the accounts were frozen. Dorothy signed what she was told to sign because the attorney explained the process in language that made resistance sound unreasonable. She did not have her own lawyer. She did not have money for one. By the end of the 2nd month, the house was sold to a developer. Dorothy received roughly $11,000 after fees, along with her personal belongings and whatever furniture the boys did not want. Dean took the truck, Ray took the tools, Tammy took the good dishes. On the last day, Dorothy stood in the empty living room. The carpet had been pulled up. The walls had marks where the pictures had hung. The front window, the one she had sat beside every evening for decades, while Frank read the paper in the other chair, looked out onto a yard she would never mow again. She picked up the last box from the hallway. Inside it was a set of towels, 2 photo albums, her sewing kit, and the small tobacco tin Frank had always kept on the shelf in the workshop. She had taken it during the inventory because neither Ray nor Dean had noticed it. It was dented, rusted at the lid, and when she shook it lightly, something shifted inside with a dry metallic sound. She did not open it that day. She put it in the bottom of the box and drove to a weekly rental motel near Swansboro. For 2 weeks, Dorothy did very little. She ate canned soup. She watched the light move across the motel wall. She called no one, and no one called her. On the 15th night, she opened the tobacco tin. Inside was a key. Not a house key or a car key. It was a brass skeleton key, old, heavy, with a worn-down shaft and a pattern cut into the bow that she did not recognize. Beneath the key was a folded piece of paper, brown at the edges, written in Frank's careful block letters. Cape Lookout Station number 4, registered in my name since 1981. I never told anyone because I was afraid they would try to take it. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and this is yours. Go there, Dorothy. It is the only thing I was ever able to keep for you. Dorothy read the note 4 times. Then she sat on the edge of the motel bed and held the key in both hands, feeling the weight of it press into her palms as the parking lot lights bled faintly through the curtain. Cape Lookout was a barrier island off the coast of North Carolina, accessible only by ferry or private boat. Frank's note did not refer to the famous diamond-patterned lighthouse. It referred to a station, one of the old auxiliary keepers' posts that had once dotted the coast before the system was automated. The next morning, Dorothy drove to the Carteret County Register of Deeds. She stood at the counter with the note and the key and asked a clerk to search the records under Frank Bellam's name. The clerk typed for several minutes, then turned the screen toward her. The record showed a Lighthouse auxiliary station on a narrow strip of coastal land. The property had been purchased in 1981 from the federal government under a historic preservation transfer for almost nothing. It included a keeper's cottage, a fuel shed, and a 32-foot cast-iron lighthouse with an intact lantern room. Owner, Frank David Bellam. Dorothy asked for a certified copy of the deed. The clerk printed it and handed it across the counter. The paper was warm from the printer and heavier in Dorothy's hands than anything she had held in a long time. She drove to the Archer's Island ferry dock that afternoon. A weathered man named Curtis Poole ran the boat service and remembered Frank. Used to come out twice a month, Curtis said. Always alone. Always carried a toolbox. The crossing took 25 minutes. Curtis pointed toward a stand of cedar trees at the north end of the inlet. That's the old station, 15 minutes on foot from the landing. Dorothy walked. The wind came in from the east, carrying salt and the smell of warm cedar. The sky was wide and sharp blue. The station appeared beyond a ridge of low dunes. The keeper's cottage was a single-story clapboard structure with a metal roof and a porch facing the water. The lighthouse stood beside it, a slender cast-iron tower painted white with a rusted gallery railing. Between them was a small brick fuel shed. The cottage was not derelict. The windows were intact, the porch was solid. She climbed the steps, put the key into the lock, and turned it. The bolt drew back cleanly, as though it had been oiled not long ago. Inside, the cottage was small, clean, and unmistakably Frank's. A main room with a kitchen counter, a wood stove, a narrow bed, and a workbench beneath the only shelf. On the workbench lay work gloves, a folding knife, and a tin of marine varnish with a receipt dated 5 weeks before Frank died. Dorothy touched the edge of the workbench. He had been here. While she thought he was going fishing, he had been coming here, keeping this place alive. She opened the cupboard above the counter. Inside were canned goods, a bag of coffee, matches, 2 oil lamps, and a stack of cloth napkins folded the way she had taught him 40 years ago. In the drawer beneath were tools, a notebook, and a brown envelope. The envelope contained the full deed, a survey map, and a second note in Frank's handwriting. This one was longer. Dorothy, I bought this place in 81 with the money I saved from the overtime shifts at the shipyard. It was almost nothing back then. Nobody wanted these old stations. I fixed the roof, replaced the porch boards, sealed the windows. I came out here every chance I got. Not to get away from you, to build something that could not be taken. I watched what happened to my mother when my father died. The family came in and took every last thing she had. I swore that would never happen to you. The boys do not know about this place. Nobody does. If you are reading this, then it is yours. The deed is in my name, but the will I wrote and sealed in the lantern room leaves everything to you. I love you. I always did, even when I did not say it enough. Dorothy sat down on the narrow bed. The springs beneath the mattress gave a familiar creak. She looked at the letter for a long time, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. She did not cry. She was too tired for that. She only breathed, slowly and deeply, the way a person breathes when something that had been pressing against their chest for months finally lifts. The next morning, she returned to the lighthouse. The door at the base matched the key. Inside, a cast-iron spiral staircase rose through the tower. Dorothy climbed slowly, feeling the wind increase with each turn. The lantern room was small, with glass panels on all sides and the old lamp framework still in place. The lens had been removed long ago, but the view was overwhelming. Water in every direction. The barrier island a thin white line. The mainland hovering on the horizon. On the floor, bolted beneath a metal panel, was a fireproof lockbox. Dorothy knelt, unscrewed the panel, and opened it. Inside was a sealed envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Frank David Bellam, notarized and witnessed. She did not open it. She carried it down the stairs, placed it in her bag, and stood outside the tower looking at the keeper's cottage, the fuel shed, the stretch of sand running down to the water. The wind moved through the cedar trees behind the station and made a sound like someone exhaling slowly. The following week, Dorothy drove to Beaufort and met with a lawyer named Patricia Yates, a woman in her mid-50s who handled property and estate cases in Carteret County. Patricia read the will, the deed, and the 2 handwritten notes. Then she set everything down on her desk and looked at Dorothy. This will is valid. It was notarized, witnessed, and predates his death by several years. It specifically bequeaths the Lighthouse station, the land, and all contents to you. What about the house, the savings? Patricia leaned forward slightly. The house and savings were handled through intestate succession because your sons claimed there was no will. But this document proves that Frank did make a will, and if he made one for this property, a court may determine that his testamentary intent extended to his entire estate, or, at the very least, that the intestate process was initiated improperly. Meaning what? Meaning your sons may have taken things that were not theirs to take. Dorothy sat with that sentence for a long moment. Outside the window, a pelican glided low across the waterway. I don't want to fight them, she said. I just want what's mine. Sometimes, Patricia answered, those are the same thing. Patricia filed a will with the county probate court the next day. She also filed a motion to reopen the estate proceedings based on the discovery of a valid testamentary document. Within 2 weeks, both Ray and Dean received formal notice. Ray called Dorothy on a Tuesday evening. She was sitting on the porch of the keeper's cottage, watching the sun lower itself behind the mainland. The phone buzzed in her pocket, and she looked at the name for a few seconds before answering. What is this, Mom? It's a will. Dad never made a will. We went through everything. You went through everything you could find. Ray was silent for a bit. Where did this come from? From a place your father kept for 40 years without telling anyone. What place? A lighthouse. The silence on the other end stretched longer. Dorothy listened to the water lapping against the shore 20 yards from where she sat. That doesn't make any sense, Ray said. Dad didn't own a lighthouse. He did. Since 1981. Ray's tone shifted, the softness dropping away like a coat taken off. If there's a property we didn't know about, it should have been disclosed during the estate process. It was not part of your process because you never asked me what I knew. You asked me to sign papers. That's different. Mom, you need to be careful here. If a lawyer is telling you, a lawyer is telling me what the law says. You had a lawyer who told you what you wanted to hear. Those are not the same thing. Ray did not call again. Dean came to the island 2 days later, arriving on a charter boat without calling ahead. Dorothy saw him walking up the path from the landing, his shoulders tight, his face set in the expression she remembered from his teenage years, whenever he had been caught doing something he knew was wrong. She was on the porch, a jar of water in her hand, the door behind her open. Dean stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the cottage, the lighthouse, the clean porch, the swept path, the orderly tools leaning against the fuel shed wall. His eyes moved the way his brothers would have, measuring, appraising, converting everything into a question of value. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "Since after you sold my house." He flinched at the word "my," but did not correct her. Dad never mentioned this place. No, he didn't. Why not? Dorothy took a slow sip of water. Because he knew exactly what would happen if he did. Dean looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the beginning of recognition that the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he had believed. "We didn't do anything wrong, Mom. We followed the law." "You followed the parts of the law that gave you things. You skipped the parts that protected me." Dean opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned and looked at the lighthouse rising behind the cottage, its white paint catching the afternoon sun. "Is it worth anything?" he asked. Dorothy set the jar down on the porch railing. "That is the first question you asked. Not whether I'm safe, not whether I have enough to eat, not whether I'm sleeping through the night, whether it's worth anything." She stood up. "Yes, Dean, it is worth something. It is worth the fact that your father loved me enough to hide it from his own sons." Dean left without going inside. Dorothy watched him walk back down the path until the dune grass swallowed his silhouette. Then she went back into the cottage, closed the door, and sat at the workbench where Frank had sat hundreds of times before her. She opened his notebook. Inside were years of entries written in the same block letters. Replaced the gallery railing bolts, October. Painted the cottage trim, April. Patched the fuel shed roof after the storm. Ordered new glass for the east panel. Each line a record of care, attention, and presence in a place no one else knew existed. The court hearing took place on a Thursday morning in Beaufort. The courtroom was small, warm, and half empty. Dorothy sat beside Patricia Yates. Across the aisle, Ray and Dean sat with the attorney from Morehead City who had handled the original estate. Patricia presented the will, the deed, the notarized documents, and the chain of ownership going back to the federal transfer program. She placed Frank's handwritten notes on the clerk's table as supporting evidence of intent. The opposing attorney argued that the will had not been discovered during the initial proceedings and that its late appearance cast doubt on its authenticity. He suggested that the property should have been disclosed as part of the estate and that the will, if valid, should be considered only in relation to the lighthouse station itself, not to the broader estate. Patricia stood and placed one additional document on the table. It was a letter from the notary public who had witnessed the will, now retired and living in Wilmington, confirming the date, the circumstances, and Frank Belham's clear and specific instruction that everything he owned was to go to his wife. "Mr. Belham did not die without a will," Patricia said. "He died with a will that his sons chose not to look for because they were too busy dividing what they could already see." The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes. Then she looked across the room at Ray and Dean. "This will is valid. It was executed with proper formality, witnessed, notarized, and its provisions are unambiguous. The court finds that the prior intestate proceedings were based on an incomplete record. The estate will be reopened and administered according to the terms of this document." She paused. I also want to note for the record that the decedent spouse was entitled to protections under state law that appear to have been inadequately observed during the initial process. I am referring this matter to the appropriate review division. Ray's attorney asked for a recess. The judge denied it. Dorothy walked out of the courthouse into the noon sun. Patricia walked beside her, carrying the file. They stopped on the sidewalk near the waterfront. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked. "The house sale proceeds will be recalculated. The accounts will be reviewed. The property distributions will be reversed or compensated. And the Lighthouse station is yours, free and clear, as it always was." Dorothy looked out at the water. A shrimp boat was moving slowly across the channel, its nets folded up like the wings of a resting bird. "He built all of that in secret," she said. "For 40 years. "Some people show love by saying it," Patricia replied. "Others show it by making sure you have somewhere to stand when everyone else walks away." Dorothy returned to the island that afternoon. She carried a bag of groceries, a new set of batteries for the oil lamps, and a bundle of wildflower seeds she had bought at the hardware store in Beaufort. She walked the path from the landing through the dune grass, past the stand of cedars, and into the clearing where the station stood against the late afternoon sky. The cottage was exactly as she had left it. The door was closed. The porch was swept. The lighthouse tower rose beside it, white and steady, casting a long shadow eastward across the sand. She set the groceries inside, then carried the seeds around to the south side of the cottage, where the sun hit longest. She knelt in the sandy soil and began making shallow rows with the edge of a shell she had picked up from the beach. The wind moved lightly through the cedar branches behind her. The sound of the water was constant and close. Over the next several weeks, the station became something more than a shelter. It became a home. Dorothy repaired the fuel shed door, cleaned the inside of the lighthouse tower, and oiled the staircase railing until it no longer left rust on her hands. She brought over a rocking chair from a second-hand shop on the mainland and set it on the porch facing the water. She hung a wind chime made from old shell casings that she found in a box beneath the workbench, something Frank must have made years ago and never hung up himself. She read his notebook every evening, not for the maintenance entries, but for the smaller notes he had written between them. "Wind from the southwest today. Saw a pod of dolphins near the inlet. Dorothy would like this light in the afternoon." That last line appeared more than a dozen times across different years. Dorothy would like this. Dorothy would like that. As though even in this hidden place, she had been the person he was thinking of the most. Curtis Poole, the ferryman, became her most regular connection to the mainland. He brought her mail, picked up supply lists, and once carried over a bag of potting soil without being asked. When she tried to pay him, he shook his head and said Frank had helped him rebuild his dock engine in '94 and never accepted $1. A woman named Grace Greer from the Harkers Island post office began stopping by whenever Dorothy came for supplies. She brought a box of kitchen things, plates, mugs, a skillet, and a jar of peach preserves. Dorothy invited her to sit on the porch. They drank coffee and watched the water without needing to fill the silence. By late spring, the garden beside the cottage had begun to take hold. White flowers came up in patches of orange, purple, and yellow. The sandy soil was not ideal, but Dorothy poured compost into the rows and watered by hand from a rain barrel she had positioned beneath the roof edge. The effort reminded her of the backyard garden at the old house, the one Ray and Dean had paved over the week after the sale. She did not think about her sons often. When she did, it was not with anger. It was with the clarity that arrives only after the dust of injustice has settled. They had not been cruel the way strangers are cruel. They had been cruel the way people are cruel when they stop seeing someone as a full human being and start seeing them as a problem to be managed. Neither of them called, neither of them came. On a warm Saturday in June, Dorothy climbed the lighthouse stairs to the lantern room, carrying a folding chair and a thermos of tea. She sat by the east-facing glass and looked out at the Atlantic under the high summer sun. She thought about Frank. Not the Frank of the last years, thin and quiet and worn down by illness, but the Frank of 1981. A young man working overtime at the shipyard, saving money, driving out to a forgotten island to buy a lighthouse nobody else wanted. A man who told no one, who came alone twice a month for 40 years to keep a building standing and a promise intact. She opened the thermos and poured tea into the cup she had brought from the cottage. The wind pressed against the glass panels and made the iron framework hum faintly. Below, the keeper's cottage sat in the clearing with its porch facing the water, its new wind chime turning slowly, its garden beginning to bloom. On the workbench inside, Frank's notebook lay open to the last entry he had ever written, dated 6 weeks before he died. The handwriting was shakier than before, the letters uneven, but the words were still clear. Checked the lantern room panel. Tight and dry. Dorothy will be all right. She looked at the horizon for a long time. Then she lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle through her. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cedar and salt, and the lighthouse stood steady above the island, the way it had always stood, white and patient, and built to last far longer than anyone expected. Not because someone had told it to endure, but because someone, quietly and without asking for anything in return, had made sure it would. If you stayed with this story until the very end, thank you for being here. If it moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, or simply let me know you were here. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting.